All right. Well, I hope you're ready to have your mind blown. We have author, podcaster, conspiracy theorist Dyer on the show, and we're going to do a lot of deep dives in this episode. He has a new book out right now. We're going to talk about that, plus what's going on with Epstein and Maxwell, the Great Reset, why Bill Gates is buying up a bunch of farmland, AI and transhumanism, media manipulation, MK Ultra, serial killers, deep underground military bases, and so much more. So before we get to it, if you could, real quick, please subscribe to my show and hit the bell on YouTube so you won't miss any notifications when I post new videos. Thank you so much. Now enjoy my interview with Dyer. Welcome to the show. I just read your latest book. It's a little above my head, I'll be honest. You go into some deep stuff here, and I feel like I need to reread it like maybe 2 or 3 times to really understand it.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I wasn't sure if it would translate to kind of audience new to philosophy or not. So maybe on one level it'll pique people's interest. They'll want to want to dig deeper. But yeah, I mean, I'm happy to try to explain anything I can. I've actually been rereading it because some of these essays I wrote, back in my 20s. So I was a little fuzzy on some of it, but I think I remember most of it.
Yeah. So, let's talk about like metaphysics. You say that's the reality itself, the study of the totality of what is. Like, I don't explain that to me.
So basically, in the history of philosophy, you have 3 branches, and so it's broken down typically into 3 branches. The first is the easiest one to get a hold of, which is just ethics. Ethics is just what's right and wrong, what motivates, our decisions to choose this over that, what makes something good or bad. And then the next domain is usually divided into epistemology, which is the branch of knowledge or knowing. So how do we know what we know? What does it mean to have knowledge as opposed to opinion? What constitutes knowledge, strictly speaking, as opposed to just a belief? Can we justify our beliefs, give a good reason for them? In other words, it's one thing to say, well, I believe that it'll rain tomorrow. I believe that, the sky is blue, so forth and so on. But let's say that I said, I believe it's going to rain tomorrow because I rolled the dice and I got a 5. And when I roll the dice and get a 5, that means it's going to rain tomorrow. Well, that's not a good reason to believe that it's going to rain tomorrow. So even if it did rain tomorrow and I was right, I didn't have a good reason to believe that it would rain tomorrow. So we want to have not just reasons for our beliefs, but good reasons for our beliefs. And usually those are the kinds of questions that are being asked in the domain of epistemology. The third domain is connected to the first 2, but it's a little more abstract, a little more difficult for a lot of people, I think, to grasp, and that's called metaphysics. So it's metaphysics, meaning beyond or above the physical. So what is it that exists? What are the types of things that exist? Is everything just matter? Is everything just energy and motion or something like that? Those are metaphysical questions. And so while physics might be concerned with the scientific discipline of matter and motion and what constitutes physical objects and how do they change position and whatnot, metaphysics is more of a ancient and medieval idea dealing with what are the different types of things that exist beyond just the physical realm. What are numbers? What are thoughts? Do they have any kind of existence? Are they all fake? Are they all real? Maybe some philosophers have said maybe fundamental reality is itself thought. And so this would be philosophers like Plato, right? So those are the kinds of questions that metaphysics is asking. Likewise, that first domain that I mentioned, ethics, let's say we think, for example, that giving to the poor is good. So if I donate money to the poor, that I think that's a good thing. Well, that can immediately relate to metaphysics, because the next kind of higher level question we could ask is, okay, but what is the good, right? If you say that giving to charity is good, I can just raise that question up the ante and say, okay, well, you tell me what good is. And those are the questions of metaphysics: good, even the beautiful in the history of philosophy. So art and aesthetics oftentimes falls under metaphysics, because if we say that, let's say, a piece of art or a musical composition is really good or beautiful as opposed to something that's crappy and it displays no talent. Well, what is it that makes that one good, aesthetically pleasing, as opposed to the, the one that's bad? And so we're asking questions like, well, then what is the beautiful? And those are questions that, Plato brings up in the Phaedo and some of his other dialogues where those kinds of metaphysical questions are asked. So that's what I would say metaphysics is.
Okay, yeah. So some of that stuff's obviously subjective, but one of the things you get into a little bit too is the materialism versus the ultimate reality. And I'm kind of more learning more about this. My dad, he actually wrote a book called Ultimate Reality, and I had on. Are you familiar with Dr. Hoffman's work at all?
There's a lot of Dr. Hoffman. What Dr. Hoffman?
Dr. Donald Hoffman. He's a so he's like a cognitive psychologist, and you talk about the quantum physics. Because I think the thing was the scientific world was always saying, that it was more a materialistic view. And now the science is showing that there may be some other reality and they're kind of diagnosing it. And Hoffman's stuff is all about kind of like, basically he describes it as not that we're actually living in the matrix, but that's kind of a good analogy for a description of the world that we see is not the real world. And so it's kind of like you're wearing a virtual headset.
Yeah, those would be parallel to Plato. So Plato had a lot of similarities to modern simulation theory or matrix theory, or these kinds of views. I think there's some insights in that, but I'm not a full-on Platonist or like a full-on matrix kind of guy. Those would be more akin to like Gnosticism. So the Gnostic worldview would be, again, very close to those ideas. And the idea there is, like you said, reality can't just be purely physical hard matter. It's got to be more than that. And so some of the essays that I put in there were trying to demonstrate that you can actually show this to be the case with things like numbers or higher dimensions, as you mentioned. And so I think that, yes, it's kind of the pendulum kind of swings in history like it. So for a long time in the ancient medieval world, you had a pendulum that swung towards the transcendent, towards Plato's ideas and these kinds of things. And then after Aristotle, after the Enlightenment, the pendulum swung over towards what you're calling, materialism and modern scientism. And so it's kind of a radical extreme. And then now it's like you said, the pendulum is swinging back the other way with things like simulation theory and higher dimensions, and a lot of the mathematicians like Max Tegmark and others who are looking at reality and saying, hey, it's actually seems like math is the fundamental, programming language of reality. And so that's, again, a swing back in the other direction. And in my view, that reality is something in the middle where we have a mix of both the physical material world and other dimensions. And so it's a both and, in my view. And the one thing I would say, not to be contentious, but you're right that in one domain of the domain of aesthetics, there is an element of the subjective. So we do have an area where certain musical styles, artistic styles will appeal to one person and not to another. But I actually think you can make a good case too that there's also some objectivity in the arts as well. And that's what allows us to avoid what sometimes is called romanticism or existentialism in the arts, the idea that it's all purely emotive. Like it's the artwork is good only because of how it makes me feel. There might, again, be that subjective element, but you can also make a good argument that no, actually, as a lot of medieval art theorists argued, you actually need some objective components like beauty, symmetry, harmony, patterns, or organization for the artwork to count even as artwork. So I think there's a case to be made for that. And even some modern atheistic philosophers like Ayn Rand, she wrote a pretty good book on arts and art theory, where she even argued that we have to have some kind of objective standards in the arts to even have the art. So just being a little more nuanced, that I agree with you, there is a subjective component, but there's also an objective reality to these things too.
So why do you think, because I feel like most of the best art is made by people who are fucked up. Like, I think one of my favorite artists is Salvador Dali. That guy seemed like he was a little nutty. And then what Van Gogh cut his ear off. I mean, a lot of this the artistic stuff is made by people who are messed up, but you're saying that it's like,
well, again, I mean, I guess that kind of depends on the period where we pick. I mean, you could pick a lot of ancient, sculptures. You could pick a lot of Renaissance art that I mean, I don't know the lives of everybody in like Bernini or any all of the Renaissance sculptors, whether they were screwed up. I guess they could have been. There is perhaps to people who have. I think all people to a degree are screwed up. So I don't know that there's
That's
something.
true. Yeah.
I don't know that there's something particularly about the arts per se. That I think that's again a kind of a romanticist era notion that to be an artist requires that you be effed up and have problems or whatever. But there could be something to that. I'm not sure how I feel about that. I'm not trying to deny the role of emotions in the arts. Certainly they play a heavy role, but I mean, it's also kind of vague in terms of how narrow it's unclear in terms of how narrow we want to specify the arts. For example, I mean, you could argue Plato's dialogues are a form of art, but there's an oddity to it where he felt like the arts should be heavily regulated. So, here's somebody who doesn't want, like he has a whole dialogue called Ion, where he's arguing that you can't let the artists run the society because they're driven by their passions and the society will collapse because they're not governed by reason. So, that's a difficult question to ask. I mean, it's a good question. I'm glad you asked it, but that's a difficult one.
Yeah. Well, so then you move on to, we talked about scientism, and you bring up some interesting points about the problems with science. And I feel like that's something that's interesting to talk about today, because I think a lot of people just kind of accept, oh, this is science, we should all just accept it. But isn't that like kind of back in the day that everyone accepted that the earth was flat? And so everyone just accepted that. And if you thought the world was round, you were nuts. And you bring up some interesting things that I had to Google this, because I was like, wait, is this real? You say carbon dating. There's issues with this. And I Googled it, and you're right. There's a lot of issues. If it's more than, they said, 40,000 years old, it's very hard because the amount of carbon left is very minuscule.
Yeah, those kinds of measurements are based on certain presuppositions baked into the worldview or the paradigm of most of the people who do the measurements. So, it's going to tell us what we assume from the outset, in other words. And a lot of science works this way, where they assume things that are in the domain of philosophy that most scientists just don't question, or that they're not familiar with, because when you go to higher education, it's very compartmentalized. So people who study physics or study geology, they don't do anything in philosophy typically. I mean, every now and then you'll have a professor, like there's a guy I really like, Dr. David Bradshaw. He has a degree in ancient philosophy and in physics, so he's a unique case. But like, wow, that's 0.01%. Like hardly anybody has two PhDs in seemingly disparate fields. And so on the one hand, there's the element of compartmentalization, where a lot of academics don't even know what basic logical fallacies are, these kinds of things. So they don't really know that when they're doing what they think is pure, quote, hard science, they're really in the domains of metaphysics. They're in the domains of philosophy, which they think isn't really necessary. A lot of pop science, especially, Neil deGrasse Tyson famously said a few years ago that philosophy is pretty much worthless. It's not needed anymore. And I think that's because he knows that he can't really answer the kinds of questions that philosophy is posing, and he doesn't realize that there's no such thing as, quote, pure science. There's no such thing as a neutral presuppositionless paradigm by which to interpret the world. We all come to the world to interpreting the world with our own presuppositions, assumptions, a kind of baked in paradigm by which we read the world. I don't think that's a problem. I think we're just, humans are just constituted that way, such that they read the world in that way. And so those again, the questions of philosophy. And science assumes that it's neutral. It assumes that it doesn't have these kinds of presuppositions, and again, doesn't realize that it's making these kinds of judgments. So, for example, science, I believe it's a tool. It's a tool for mastering and understanding the natural world, but it can't tell you values. It can't give you value judgments. Famous Enlightenment atheist David Hume even said, being more consistent than most of his skeptical scientism buddies, that you can't get an ought from an is. In other words, describing the features of the way things are, which is a metaphysical domain, by the way, doesn't tell you whether that's good or bad, whether it ought to be that way or ought not to be that way, right? So one of the easy ways to see the flaws of modern scientism is that scientism can't tell you good or bad. It can't tell you what are called value judgments, because that's the domain of ethics and metaphysics. And so just reading or interpreting the data doesn't tell you whether that's the data you ought to have or ought not to have. But most people who have the scientism worldview or presuppositions, like they tend to think that they're on a moral high horse, they have a moral high ground, they're prepared to tell, you know, all of the superstitious religious people or whatever who don't agree with them how they should or should not live, what does and doesn't exist, and so forth, which again, the limitations of the scientific method can't even do that. So that's kind of what I try to point out.
Yeah, no, it's just the biases. Like you say, much of the scientific literature may be untrue. And you say about, because half of the studies that are done are sponsored by industries. So they're going to sponsor a study that's going to favor whatever it is, their product that they're pushing. And even, I mean, this was fascinating. The editor of the New England Journal of Medicine for 2 decades, I think it was was it a she or he? I think it was a she, said she doesn't trust all the research that's published. And that's the New England Journal of Medicine. I mean, that's a pretty telling statement.
Yeah, I just had the great opportunity to be on a podcast yesterday with James Lindsay, and I didn't recognize right away. We had to do a little bit of the podcast before I realized, oh, he's that guy. But he's the guy who Joe Rogan had on a couple of years ago, who with his buddy, they had published a whole bunch of like fake peer review studies as a test to see if you could get fake peer review studies published. And I think they got almost all of them. Yeah. So I was on that podcast with that guy and we were talking. I was like, oh, you're that dude. I was like, man, that's awesome that you did that. I said, you're a hero of mine for doing that, because if I recall, I think he's the guy that got that goofy joke study published about how dog parks were racist because they didn't have like gay dog sections.
Yeah. Something like
So that's another example of that. There used to be a great website too that would track peer review fraud. I can't remember if it still exists, but you can look it up. There's like a website that just tracks, science fraud publications. And so the other reason I kind of knew about this was not because my mom was dealing with science fraud, but my mom was an editor for many years for the biggest science journal publisher, Harcourt Brace, and she did that for about 15 years. And what I got from her doing that was that there's a clear little known relationship between billion-dollar mega corporations, publishing corporations, and peer-reviewed science. And most people don't even know that, but I mean, yeah. Do we honestly think that billion-dollar mega corporations tied into, all the other mega corporations, big pharma, that they don't have an influence in the science that's published? I mean, has not the last couple of years shown that, I think, to people who have an open mind?
Well, right, because where's the money from that are the donations for these universities? Who's donating that money?
Yeah, one thing I learned too when I was at university was that there's an intimate relationship too between the university system and the textbooks, and not just the university boards who decide what textbooks and whatnot, but the big corporations have a say in what the university textbooks say. So again, there's this incestuous relationship between what's supposed to be a public institution of a university and the private corporate interests that print the textbooks and the boards who decide what textbooks will be used. And so, yeah, you better believe that they have a say so in what college students learn in terms of their biology texts, their nutrition texts, which are going to be influenced by big pharma as well. So yeah, it's a giant scam in my view.
Yeah. Well, this book, you mentioned this book in chapter 7, Karl Popper's The Open Society and Its Enemies. And it's something about how fighting against an ideology or philosophy that has a common goal, value, or meaning. And you said that George Soros, which I have a book on him and I had not read it yet, but he regards this book, the Open Society one, as his personal Bible. So what does that mean exactly? So we should not, because it seems like there's also this thing about the world government and everything should be the same, but then we should also not have a common goal.
Well, the common goal is to let the elites decide what the common goal is, and you just do what they tell you to. And so Popper right. is part of what's called the Vienna Circle, and they were the logical positivists of the 20th century, sort of the radical empiricists. People like Bertrand Russell was involved in these groups. And they had a very fairly open idea that they wanted to promote world government. Some of these philosophers were tied into Quigley's book, Anglo-American Establishment and the Royal Society Elites. So there was a close connection between the Royal Society and the Vienna Circle. empiricist slash positivist. And Popper is one of those key figures who, really promotes this idea of open, liberal, quote unquote, democracy, which is really just open, free markets. That's why Soros is a big fan of that, right? Because he likes to sort of manipulate markets in these different countries that, for example, he recently was talking about the former Soviet bloc. Soros was instrumental in being allied with the CIA back in the 80s and 90s under Reagan to open up those Soviet bloc countries to free market capitalism, not because of any sincere interests to free these people up, but it was a scam to, once the Soviet economy had collapsed, they would come in and buy all this stuff up. Then they open it up to so-called Western liberalism and color revolutions. And so that's what we've been seeing for the last several decades. F. William Engdahl has a great book on the color revolutions and how all that works, called Full Spectrum Dominance. And he covers Karl Popper and Popper's philosophy of open society, and then how that relates to Soros as being kind of allied with the CIA for these Cold War operations, which open it up to economic liberalism.
Yeah. So you said Anglo elites want to control. This is weird. They want to control the natural resources for immortality. How can you be immortality by controlling the resources?
I don't remember that exact. I'm not saying that it's wrong, but if I recall, I was implying that the goal of the Anglo-American establishment would be to eventually obtain immortality through technology. So in order to corner the markets in the domain of natural resources are what are necessary to not just control the world, but there's an end goal. It's not just control. It's actually also the idea that technology can eventually produce, a means of immortality. And so that's the whole transhumanist movement. But transhumanism requires, the big tech elite, for example, Bill Joy, the Sun Microsystems guy, he wrote a famous essay in Wired magazine called "Why the Future Doesn't Need Us." I did a whole episode of Alex's show the other day, or actually a few weeks ago, on that essay, and I recommend reading that essay. It's not that long, but you'll notice if you read Bill Joy's essay, he's the guy that created Sun Microsystems, a big early tech billionaire guy. And he was talking about the meetings in Silicon Valley that he had with people like Ray Kurzweil, the famous transhumanist, and how they were discussing immortality. And he, in that essay, talks about how it would be that the 20th century's attempt to control the natural resources is ultimately for the purpose of transhumanism. So that's the essay I would say to read if you want the lowdown on why that is the case.
Yeah, I mean, because they're already working the Neuralink stuff, and I had a guy on the show, Dr. Morin Surf, and he's talking about how you're going to put this chip in your brain, and it's gonna give you more power to like manipulate the stock markets and things like that. And he said he compared it to like breast implants. He's like, oh well, people are going to see that other people have this upgrade, and then you're going to want it too.
Yeah, but I mean, the odd part about that is that if you look at Ray Kurzweil's book, Singularity, he has a chapter where he talks about VR, virtual reality, and what would later be called metaverse, because I think he wrote that book in 2005 or 6. But he talks about this too, that eventually it won't need to be a chip implanted. It'll be what he says is an advanced form of nanotech, which will just be in your body. And he says it can come between you and your perception of the external world. And he says that it will not only be a thing where you link in and experience cool things, but he says that a centralized authority could also control you. So it's a two-way thing here, right? It's like the Palantir stone in Lord of the Rings, right? Where Pippin looks into it and sees Sauron, but Sauron can also see back at him. And so it's a two-way thing that Kurzweil talks about, and even admits that, yeah, you might be able to have certain advantages if the technology works, but it's a two-way thing. It's a back door where they can also put things into your head.
Do you think it's going to be a voluntary thing that people are going to want to sign up for this? Or do you think some people will be skeptical?
I think eventually they'll promote it as something hip, trendy, and voluntary, and then see how that goes. And then eventually and gradually try to make it eventually mandatory. In fact, one of the white papers that I covered this year was the UK Ministry of Defense white paper on transhumanism and brain chips. And that's what they say. They say eventually they'll just alter through social engineering people's attitudes towards these things to make it a government mandate.
Scary shit. Well, so you mentioned in chapter 10 quantum mechanics, and you mentioned CERN. You don't go into it a lot, but explain, what are your thoughts on that? What that is? I don't really know a lot about it. I just heard about it about a month ago because I think they just recently turned it back on. It's this big machine that they're trying to find the God particle. I don't even know if I understand. Do you understand that stuff?
I don't have a hard opinion on CERN. I know like what they say about what it is publicly, that it's, this thing that is just studying, minuscule level physics. And I just kind of purposed some of the physicists who got into philosophy, like Wolfgang Pauli, Werner Heisenberg, and people. So they're speculative physicists who, were involved in, I don't know if they're involved directly in CERN, but their research is the kind of stuff that CERN does, where they're looking at, tiny, tiny particles to see what's down there in those lower dimensions. And what I found most relevant was that they talk about it like it's structured, that it has patterns and forms, and that would speak to the kind of world that Plato talked about in the Timaeus and some of his other dialogues, which is where we have these ideas of Platonic solids, that fundamental reality is geometrically structured. And to me, that suggests design. And, a lot of people prior to the 20th century couldn't see reality at that level. So they wouldn't have had an insight into reality being that highly structured. And so that shows that it's not just pure chaos. There's a fundamental design there to reality. So that's the reason that I was including that. There's a lot of speculations as to what CERN really does. Anything from trying to open up portals, dimensions. I mean, it could be any of those things. I've sometimes I speculate that these kinds of things might also be for other reasons, like security, surveillance purposes. It could be something like that, and the particle physics is a cover for it. But it could be any of those things. So I just kind of looked at it from the vantage point of what they claim about minuscule particles, being structured.
It is fascinating. I hope something happens. I hope something comes out of that. You mentioned too, Darwin theory. Explain the link with Freemasons. How did that come
so
about?
Darwin's, I'm going from either dad or granddad. The Collins brothers have a really good book where they go into a lot of depth with this. In fact, their new book is called Invoking the Beyond. They're buddies of mine, and they wrote a really long book on not just the history of Darwin, but its relationship to the British Empire, social engineering. And it was either Darwin's dad or granddad was a really prominent Freemason, and he wrote these poems about Hindu philosophy and Hindu thought, which appear to have influenced Darwin himself in terms of formulating his view, which again is not really a scientific view because it goes far beyond the limitations of what the scientific method can actually prove or show. So it's packed with all these metaphysical assumptions about what occurred millions of years ago, about the transmutation of species. And the irony is that, Darwin's view is not new. It wasn't even novel in his day. People before him had posited this kind of a view. Even ancient Greek philosophers had a version of evolutionary theory. And even prior to them, ancient Hindu thought is really the source of Darwinian evolutionary theory.
Yeah. Well, and he even says there's the problems with his theory. One of them, which being we've never been able to recreate that in a lab setting, because they say like this bolt of lightning struck I just love this term, primordial goo, and then that's created the amoebas and the fish and then everything. But we've never been able to recreate that. So.
Yeah, and it's built on a whole bunch of other assumptions too. That, for example, one species or one type of creature can start to print the unique code of some other creature. So that's what's required for it to be the case, to have the transmutation of species. And, DNA says that that's not possible. You'll never have a bear printing whale code or a whale printing frog code. They always are going to print the same code that exists. Even the mutations are only the mutations that would be possible in a minor variation within that species, right? So you might get a frog with 10 fingers or something that's a mutation, but that's never going to get you to another species. And that's why they always just say, oh well, but if there was zillions of years it would happen. But again, that's never empirically observed. This is supposed to be an empirical observed science. And not only can the principles of transmutation of species and whatnot not be empirically observed. Most of these people are empiricists in terms of their philosophy, and you can't even prove empiricism, because how can you prove through empirical sense data that all knowledge comes through empirical sense data? You can't.
Yeah.
It's an impossible proposition to prove.
Yeah, and another example you give in your book that was really interesting about when you talk about like the Grand Canyon, how people assume that it took millions of years, but then you give these examples of things that was it in the Bighorn Mountains, a gash or something near in Wyoming took.
Yeah, I mean it's not as big as the Grand Canyon,
yeah.
but there was one that opened up within a day. Yeah, that's pretty sizable. Exactly.
And a Fly Ranch geyser in Nevada, it sprung up over a few decades from humans drilling. We caused that.
Yeah, so people go out and party at this area. There's a giant geyser there that that drilling, as you said, caused. And I think it was in about 40 years, they had a giant calcite deposit. And the typical narrative explanation for those kinds of things is, oh, that takes 11 million years for that to form or whatever, which is just not true. I mean, there's houses from the 1800s that have in their basements, stalactites and stalagmites that have formed, within 100 years. That again are supposed to take millions of years. Yeah.
And then you have a chapter about numbers. This is always interesting to me because, they say 7 is associated with perfect, 666, the devil. Like, why is that exactly? I mean, you kind of explain it, but I'm still confused.
Well, so there's two different things here. One is number theory, which is the metaphysical question of what are numbers. Mm-hmm. And then there's a separate question of number symbolism or numerology. And so the reason, for example, 7 is relevant is that the world seems to be structured on a 7-day week. And the best explanation that I have for that is that the Bible explains that in the book of Genesis. We have God creating the world and the 7th day being the Sabbath. And so there's a fundamental 7-day structure to the week, which is just primordial. It goes back to the ancient world. And so that's probably the origin of 7 being significant, marking the days off in that way, and the origin of ancient calendars, which I don't actually think anybody really knows the total. The further we go back in history, 6,000 years or whatever, 5,000 years, the further we go back, the more speculation is involved on ancient cultures and how they did what they did. So there's far more that we don't know than what we do know. So I was mainly just pulling from biblical symbology in terms of the Old Testament and what the significance of 7 is, the significance of a triplicity of 6s. A 666 would be kind of an inverted version of the Trinity. It would be a triad that's not perfect, that's imperfect. And so it would be lacking that the perfection of the number 7 or the completion of a week. It's also in scripture the number of a man or humanity. And so, there's multiple reasons why 6 would be referred to man. And of course, 666 is the number of talents of gold that Solomon would bring in as Solomon sort of in his later years apostatizes from God and becomes this sort of type or antichrist type of figure. And that's why I think in the apocalypse, John uses 666, which is also coded terminology for Nero, in my view. So I think John was talking about Nero, the emperor at that time, and how he, as a persecutor of early Christianity, was seen as this antichrist figure. So those are some of the reasons why 7 and 6 and 666 are seen that way in scripture.
Yeah. And then
number theory is a different thing, though, where we're talking about like in that early, like we were talking about at the beginning with metaphysics, like, well, we all know what the number 2, 3, 4, what those are, but what is a number? Where is a number? What kind of existence do numbers have? Are they just in our heads? Do they exist in some realm? Are they just words we make up? Are they social constructs, right? Those are the kinds of questions that metaphysics asks about numbers and number theory.
Yeah, it's hard to come up with an answer for that. It's weird too. The computer programs are just a series of numbers, zeros and ones.
Right. And there's a chapter on that as well, because I'm just trying to use computers as an analogy for how, we look at computers and we see them as machines that are clearly designed and structured. And so by the same logic, we should look at the world as designed and structured. Again, I don't believe in simulation theory, but one thing that the simulation theory people have correct is that they see that analogy that I'm making. They see that point that, well, hey, wait a minute, reality is highly structured, kind of like computer programs for playing a video game or structure. And so basically this is just the return of the notion of telos or design, right? Something that Enlightenment atheists threw away. They said, oh, there's no design. Look at the mutations in the world. There's no design. But now we can see even, fundamentally smaller levels of reality such that they are designed, which brings the notion of telos or design back into the world.
Oh, yeah. Fascinating stuff. Like I said, I need to read it again because it's like so deep, but yeah, it makes you think too. You got to take it slow. I think I read it a little too fast, but it's a lot of good stuff in there. And
well, I appreciate you reading it.
Yeah, no, it's great. Hopefully people I need to read. I think I've read your first book and this one. You have another Hollywood esoteric though. The second one, I haven't read that one yet either. So
yeah, that one I think was better written. The sequel, I mean, the first one was just kind of my freshman book outing, and then I think the part two, I was a better writer by the time that I wrote a lot of those. So it didn't sell as many copies as the first one, but it's actually a better written book. But
okay. Yeah, I'll have to check that out. You have so many conspiracy theories. We got to talk about that. I think last time you were on, we didn't talk about. I didn't even ask you about Alex Jones because you guest for him on his show on Infowars. Have you seen his latest video where he's like the thing about the threatening to cut his finger off? And have you seen that one?
Yeah, I thought that was really funny.
Yeah,
It cracked me up.
He said, "I'll cut my penis off. I'll cut it off right."
Yeah, I think he knows how to do these really sensational, sort of satire pieces, and he knows the media will pick it up as if he was being serious.
Is that
okay?
So
he's not really going to cut his finger off.
Right. I know, but they picked it up. So
yeah, and they were like, he's insane. He's going to cut his finger off.
How did you get hooked up? Did he like seek you out, or do you actually like sit and hang out with him sometimes, or is it just a thing where like the producer picked you out and you fill in for him when he's not there?
Well, Alex had been aware of my stuff for a long time because I had called in to Alex back in 2006, 5 or 6, and he liked what I was talking about because I'd read a bunch of global elite stuff even back then, and so he was like, "Hey, call back Monday. I want to have you back." And so I called back Monday, and I was a mini guest, I guess you could say, for about 30 or 45 minutes, and then I wrote back then probably 5 or 6 articles for Infowars back in the day, 2005 or 6, and then nothing much ever came of that. I did some satire videos and impressions that they put up back in the day. And then I guess just the channel grew, and his producer is a big fan of the stuff that I do. A lot of people that are at his operation like my material. And so I had actually missed the email. She sent me an email and it went into my spam box. And she was like, "Hey, do you want to, come on the show and be a guest?" That was 2 years ago. And so I dug that email magically out of none of this would have ever happened if I hadn't checked the spam box. But so I was like, yeah, sure. I'd love to come on. And, he was impressed with the interview that we did. And so that led to sort of hosting about once a week, the 4th hour. And then, so I've been in studio. We've been hung out in some of the protests and whatnot a couple times. So I've spent a few days with Alex, which he's just the same in person as he is on air. So he's always just super energized and raring to go. But yeah, so that opened a lot of doors too. So I'm very thankful for that. But yeah, I really enjoy hosting because it kind of gives me the ability to speak to really big audience. And I usually take the lecture series material for the Global Elite books, which now I think we've done about 50 or 60 top writings of the elite. I usually just take one of those and put that into that 4th hour. Yeah, no, it's great stuff. Well, I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about the biggest thing right now. I mean, I think is the Ghislaine Maxwell and Epstein Island. I heard you talk a little bit about this. I didn't know, because I'm watching the show about Maxwell on HBO or whatever, but I don't know if I knew that you said her dad was connected to the KGB and was a Cold War spy. Or tell me more about that. Yeah, he's a master spy. Robert Maxwell was the Epstein of the 60s, the 50s and 60s, the Cold War. And he was a British media baron. And I actually just finished a book on that because I didn't know a whole lot about the whole background of. I did a interview with a good buddy of mine who's a Russia analyst, Mark Hackard, and he translated a essay that a KGB colonel wrote back in the Cold War about Maxwell, and that's her dad. And so that's how she learned the art of all of this blackmail and sexual entrapment stuff, was from him. And he was doing all these same operations back in the I guess the 60s and 70s. But yeah, he ended up having a sort of mysterious death where he started going against some of his masters, and that a lot of people think that ended up with him meeting his death on a boat in the ocean somewhere.
You think it might have been an Israeli intelligence?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, that might have also been who got rid of him, because he kind of tried to turn on them. So
yeah. So I mean, I don't understand how this list. Everyone's talking about the list that Maxwell should have some, or I feel like more than one person would know who was at these parties and things. Why is that not being? How is that? I mean, I don't even think that's a conspiracy theory. It's just, how is this list not being published? It's very bizarre.
Well, probably, people are afraid of publishing it because, there could be serious consequences for that. So, I don't know what's on the list. I don't know any more than anybody else, but I did read it. I know more about her dad and his history than her, or speculations about her and that operation. But I think we can clearly see that these kinds of operations are pretty standard. I mean, I'm not trying to downplay it, because it's pretty crazy stuff, but like, her dad was doing the same stuff in the Cold War period. The Franklin scandal covers a similar type of operation in the 80s. There's Savile Elm House in the UK, which is doing the exact same stuff, blackmailing people, high profile politicians in the UK. Elm Guest House, it's called. So, this is a more prevalent thing than we previously knew about, but of course all the conspiracy theorists knew about it and talked about it. And if you remember the DC Madam, Deborah Jean Palfrey, she was supposedly suicided. She was talking about the same kinds of operations. My publisher has a book. What is that guy's name? There's a guy that published a book. It may be called Confessions of a DC Madam. I'm getting it mixed up with the other one, but it's the same thing, but with gay stuff. So there's another guy, Henry Vincent, I think is his name.
Okay.
He's like Deborah Jean Palfrey, but it was just like entrapping gay politicians and people.
Okay. So
he ran that kind of operation in DC. So in other words, this goes on, and this is a big part of how the system works, and how we have so many corrupt politicians, because large portion of them are sexually blackmailed, and people in Hollywood too. Right.
Right. So this is just one pedophile party, or whatever you want to call
one
it.
Operation.
Yeah, one operation. Because I had a sex trafficking expert. She's not a conspiracy theorist, but she works with sexually trafficked girls. And she said, I asked her, is there going to be another Jeffrey Epstein? And she said, oh, absolutely. So do you think there's
operations right now running the same stuff in other parts of the world? I mean, for example, Eastern Europe, Romania. I just read a big long report about this the other day. That's like a huge hub for this stuff. So yeah, it goes on all the time.
Do you know any names or any ones in the U.S. that are currently happening that have just not been exposed yet?
No, I don't. I mean, I don't know any of that.
Any sort of hints of things of people that might be involved, or?
I mean, again, nobody who knows those kinds of things is going to just say people's names. I mean, all I know is what's in the public domain in terms of books that have been published on that material. And then there's a guy who wrote an essay about Eastern European gangs and human trafficking. So you could look up something like look up Eastern Europe, human trafficking, and you'll get articles on that. Public, like, law enforcement articles.
Okay, because there was another example that I heard you talk about that I had to Google this. I'd never heard about. I felt like this should have been a big story. The Pickton Pig Farm. Explain that one to my audience. That was a crazy thing that I heard you talk about.
All right. So there's a guy who puts up serial killer stuff of archive footage of interviews with them. And the theory there is that a lot of the serial killers may be connected to organized crime. They may be, in fact, contract killers or hitmen. And some of those instances may be connected to, human trafficking as well, because that's part of organized crime. So There was some people who had done some podcasts theorizing that, I don't remember this person's name, but they theorized that the Pickton Pig Farm could have been one of those kinds of operations because they had, it's a famous serial killer incident, and they sort of burned the lower level guy, but the rest of the people involved in this big compound, like Hell's Angels and the others, that sort of went up to high level people in the Canadian government. So the theory is that it might have been some kind of entrapment operation or SNUFF film operation or something like that, because of the high level people who didn't get in trouble, but they just burned this kind of scrubby, skanky, low level dude that was running it on the ground.
So yeah, because the people that go to these parties and such. So maybe like even Epstein was more just like a pawn.
Yeah, I think he was the point man to run that operation, and he seemed to have had connects to various intelligence agencies to have the blackmail data. Basically, I mean I don't think he was like some super high level person.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting.
He was put there to run the operation.
So the people,
middle management kind of person.
Yeah, you talk about a lot of this, the Great Reset. Let's talk about that then. So the global government, the global economy, all this stuff. So yeah, because this one was confusing. Why are all these rich people putting money into leftist organizations? Explain that to my audience.
Well, I think that they've always seen liberalism as a tool for social change. It's a really powerful and effective tool for that. And so one thing that especially socialism and Marxist movements do is that they level the existing order and they consolidate wealth, because Marx always said, one of the first things you have to do is create a centralized Federal Reserve type of bank. And that allows all the money to be printed by this central entity. But of course, the real owners of the central banks are not the public, but they're private. So it's a private Federal Reserve based system, which is what we have. We've had it since 1913 in the US. And, it is one of the planks of the Communist Manifesto. So although I don't think the global conspiracy is a quote Marxist conspiracy, Marxism had a very important role to play in bringing about the world that we are going into. And it was always aided and funded by very wealthy individuals. This is, Professor Anthony Sutton has a series of books on how elite, wealthy individuals funded Hitler, funded the Bolshevik revolutions and socialism. So look at Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution, or Wall Street and Hitler by Sutton, and you'll get the same information that we find in Dr. Carol Quigley's Tragedy and Hope, where he also says that the most wealthy people in the U.S. funded the liberal socialist causes for social engineering, because they have an agenda and ideology which they want to bring about. And so liberalism is just a means for that, really.
So the divisiveness, that's on purpose though, right? That's the way to kind of destroy, or what did you say? Something about like, we're going to destroy ourselves with all this stuff.
I'm not sure which specific what you're talking about, where I said we destroy ourselves, but what do you mean? Like what?
Well,
yeah, I mean, they certainly
the zero population growth. So so first we said, there was a push for gay marriage and such like that. Then it was transgender. You said bestiality is going to be the next rights thing.
Yeah, I think all of those are going to be pushed because they're useful again for this goal of creating ZPG, zero population growth, zero carbon output, as they're calling it. That's the goal of all the carbon stuff, is to basically just ensure that there's no more humans, because they are committed to post-humanism. And post-humanism is a transhumanist worldview. So you can see this, for example, in today's radicals are groups like Extinction Rebellion, right? The radical eco people. There's prominent people who think that there should be no humans, and they tend to believe that we can be downloaded into computers. So even though they don't believe that there is consciousness, that they claim that they're going to download their consciousness into computers. So it's not a consistent view, but it's kind of a crazed sort of cult type of view, really. But they really do believe that. And so all of these events that are occurring in terms of the Great Reset, it's really to get to that end goal. In fact, Klaus's book actually says that, like the first 2/3 of the book is about why we need, this global Great Reset. And the last third of the book, Fourth Industrial Revolution by Klaus, says that, well, we need to remake and retool the entire biosphere to make it synthetic, because it's broken, and the way to fix it is to alter human DNA to change everything in society to radically reduce the population 90 to 95%. I mean, this is what they believe.
Yeah. So what is the thing with your favorite, as you call him, Gil Bates, the CEO of Microsoft? So he's buying like all this farmland, and they keep pushing this like fake meat shit, and they're going to try to make people eat bugs. I think, is that the next thing? It's going to be crickets or something. They're going to cricket proteins. Is that going to be, or what is the eating bugs? Because the fake meat shit's already out.
Yeah, this is an old technique of oligarchs to control population by controlling their diet. I mean, it's just a really simple form of warfare, basically. And so, if you think about it in terms of siege is a form of warfare where people are locked up in their redoubt or their Helm's Deep or whatever. And so, siege involves all the different techniques that you would do to break their defenses and to destroy them in their castle. And so, one of those would be, for example, controlling the food supply. So if I can control what food comes into the society or how they eat or what they eat, it's a tremendous form of warfare. Again, this is very well known. It's ancient warfare. It comes up in even some of the global elite writings, Bertrand Russell, Charles Galton, Darwin. I mean, in their books, they have sections on, in order to depopulate, we're going to have to take control of the food supply. So I think that's 100% what it is.
Yeah, and then also education. I mean, you talked about the Neuralink and all that stuff. You're saying that or I don't know if it was you or Alex Jones that had said, I heard with the education thing with the Neuralink, you're not going to have access to a lot of the history and the past education. You're only going to have access to the things that's like the North Korea kind of stuff.
Yeah, this is what Jacques Attali says in his book, Brief History of the Future. He's one of the globalists. He's the Kissinger of France, basically. And he says that by 2040, every house will have its own sort of AI version of Alexa, right? So you'll have a personal house assistant that doesn't just, quote, assist you around the house. It will also be where you get education from. So you won't go to school or anything like that. You'll have this bot that educates you. And he says that it's not like you're going to have some free internet where you look up whatever you want. It'll be a one-way thing where it teaches you and tells you what you need to know. Some it's just straight up dystopia, right? Like all the science fiction dystopias wrapped into one. And I mean, that's what he says. But he even says that the hive mind that everybody will be linked into, he calls it Gollum.
Wow. So it's all about controlling the population. So we're basically, they want us to be slaves is what the goal could be.
Yeah. I mean, I think these people are psychopathic control freaks. Absolutely. 100%.
So and with the media, what's going on? Because the media seems so weird. Just in my lifetime, I've seen a drastic change from just regular, used to be just reporting the news. Now we have this, like what my friend calls fad politics. Like, it's just like, there's always some sort of cause. Like for a while it was the Ukraine thing, which again, I'm not necessarily siding with Russia, but it seemed like it was like a real big push to like, why was there such a big push for the Ukraine thing? Because there's tons of wars in the Middle East and Africa that nobody's talking about those. Nobody's cared about those. But all of a sudden, something about Ukraine was this big deal, and everyone had to change their Facebook profile pictures. And what is there a conspiracy behind that?
Could you ask? I'm sorry, somebody, my important person was calling me. I'm trying to turn off the phone so it doesn't ring.
Right.
Could you repeat that question?
No, just with the fad politics, it seems like there's always this push for some sort of cause. It changes. But like for a while there, it was Ukraine. And I was suspicious. I didn't pick a side. I didn't do a lot of research as to the conflict. I mean, I knew some of the basic things, but it just seemed odd that there was such a push to pray for Ukraine and all this stuff. It just seemed strange to me. It seemed, I don't know if there was a nefarious motive or not. Maybe I'm just being paranoid, but it just seemed odd that with all these other wars going on in the world and a lot of genocide in Africa and the Middle East and terrible things, people being bombed, that's not a big thing. But for some reason, why was Ukraine the big one?
Well, because the media is controlled and it puts out what they want people to be concerned about or to have a pseudo activism about. So yeah, activism is a complete scam. It's a complete joke. I mean, there's plenty of people who are sincere about their activism, sure, but anything the system is telling you to be involved in activism about is just a joke, and it's really just propaganda is all it is.
Yeah, well then, so like Ukraine would be big for a while, and then it was like there'd be a shooting, And then that's the big thing. So let's talk a little. I've had an expert on here about mass shooters and such. What is I can't remember if we talked about this last time or not, but I'm curious to get your thoughts on some of the mass shooters. And I mean, I think that you say that a lot of them have ties to CIA or the government. A lot of them have ties to occult or satanic things.
Well, no, serial killers.
Oh, serial killers. Sorry,
not
yeah.
necessarily mass shooters.
But you
Although
said
some of
something too
them
about
could.
the manifestos. They always find these manifestos of the mass shooters, and a lot of them are very similar. And you
Correct.
think that's
Right.
on
Sometimes they're copy and paste. So like the
copy and paste.
Breivik, Anders Breivik, his was an odd sort of copy and paste thing. This goes back to the Unabomber with the manifesto goes back to him. He was openly involved in MK Ultra. He was part of the MK Ultra experiments. It's in his obituary that he was involved in MK Ultra experiments. So it's very odd that he then becomes this, so-called terrorist figure after MK Ultra experimentation. And then the odd part is that the main locus of his message revolves around transhumanism and the AI grid that they're bringing in. So he was warning people about technocracy, and what do you know? He's this quote terrorist, right? So the very thing that was being planned for a long time, technocracy, right? You need the people who warn about it to be seen as these radical, terror figures, and that's exactly seemingly the function that he served. Likewise, they sort of mind controlled, staged, created maniac killer people, whether serial killers and mass shooters are a kind of a serial killer. So I understand the overlap there, but I think some of these mass shooter types are just sort of drugged out. A lot of them are on SSRI types of drugs. A lot of them have, handlers and people who work for intelligence agencies, sort of provoking them, riling them up. That's a pattern that comes out all the time, especially the Islamic TERROR networks. That's especially an infiltrated and controlled type of thing. And the same with right-wing militias and these people too. They're all sort of handled in this way. And so there's you can't definitively prove that all of them are, caused by intelligence agents, but the patterns and the handlers seem to consistently be there, which is again, legitimate question. But in regard to the serial killers, what's a more interesting connection is that a lot of them were part of the military. And so it's odd that so many serial killers had military service and seem to have been stationed in suspicious areas, seem to have been part of LSD research. For example, we know that Berkowitz went into the military and took LSD. We know that Gary Heidnik was involved in MK Ultra. He's one of the most famous serial killers as well. During his Vietnam service, he was involved in MK Ultra. We know that the Phoenix program, according to Douglas Valentine, included training individuals that they profiled to be psychopathic to engage in cannibalism and human mutilation and sacrifice. That was part of the Viet Cong. That was a part of the warfare against the Viet Cong. And so a lot of these serial killers had Vietnam service. And so the theory is that they could have been involved in the Phoenix program. And this is why we have this outbreak of serial killers in the 70s and 80s, because guys coming back from Vietnam who had basically gone nuts.
Yeah, I think you said, I never heard this before. Jeffrey Dahmer was investigated for murders in Germany while he was stationed there because he was in the military. That's crazy.
He was stationed 20 minutes from where Heidnik was stationed too. I don't think they were there at the same time because they were Heidnik, I think, was a little older. But it's odd that you have two of the most prominent serial killers stationed in U.S. German bases within a few minutes from each other, and they both come back to America to be the craziest serial killers in American history. That's really suspicious in my book. So the theory is that they could have been involved in some form of mind control projects as well. And I can't authenticate it, but there's a cable that surfaced that shows that a prominent general squashed the German government investigating Dahmer for those murders in Germany.
Wow, crazy. What about, do you know anything about the Montauk Project? I learned about this after I had you on the first time, and this thing just really fascinated me. It seems like there's not a lot of information on it that I can
Yeah,
find.
I've just seen a few, like you said, I've just seen a
Yeah.
few passing references and videos and maybe a chapter here and there in a book. But because I've tried to read most of the sourced material that's out there in MKUltra, so you'll see it in passing. But it seems to have been this sort of project of taking kids and putting them into these sort of programs, which is what Stranger Things, the TV show, is playing
Right.
on. They're sort of playing on the Montauk Project. I have no doubt that it was real, but we just don't know much about it. But there's other programs that we do know about that are very similar to that, where they would experiment on kids. Dr. John C. Lilly, the famous psychonaut weirdo who had a fetish for dolphins, he talks about mind controlling kids in his books. Um, Dr. Kinsey, I mean, he molested kids for science, and everybody knows about that. So it shouldn't seem far fetched that they would, kidnap kids or use orphans or whatever for these projects either.
Yeah. What about, do you know about this one? This is another one I just recently found out about, Operation High Jump and Richard E. Byrd and the stuff that's going on in Antarctica. What's going on there? There's some sort of government base there or?
Um, I have heard of high jump. I don't know much about it. I did a video just speculating about Antarctica. I know it's obviously an important geostrategic region in terms of geopolitics, but I have no idea what. I mean, I have no idea what the deal with Antarctica is. There is an odd situation with Bundy, who has a lot of connections to prominent and intelligence connected people. So Ted Bundy was a roommate for a year or two with a CIA Department of Defense cover individual who was involved, I think, in high jump.
Do you think so if Bundy and Dahmer and these guys are being mind controlled, do they know they're being mind controlled, or is it totally out of their like they think they don't know how this happened?
Well, there's different types of mind control. There's different possibilities. Only a small percentage of the public can be hypnotized or is uh, possibly a dissociative. It can go into dissociative states. So it's hard to know or hard to say because, again, it's speculation. We do have Dr. Esterbrook's writing a famous essay that is still sourced in the DSM, which says that he could create hypnotic couriers where information would be stored in one of the altars. Now, is it possible that he was just making that up? It is possible, but it's also possible that he really could do that. And so, he was writing that at the time of the 50s, and this kind of stuff would inspire things like Manchurian Candidate and movies like this, which have this theme. And then, of course, now, since the 50s, Hollywood has had dozens and dozens of movies with the idea of mind controlled assassins and mind controlled couriers and all this kind of stuff. So, it's in the literature, but as to how advanced or how far they can go with it is who knows.
Yeah, well, because like the MK Ultra, I mean that came out that the Unabomber was involved in that. Like that was
Right.
public information.
Right.
Now MK Ultra is not going on right now, but you think there's got to be something that evolved into something else, or there's a different project for that, right?
Right. So even back in the 70s, one of the first books on it was 1978 book by John Marks. It's called The Search of the Manchurian Candidate. And the last chapter in John Marks's book is about how MK Ultra evolved into MK Search and MK Delta, which means that it went under bio warfare and human genetics. So all of DARPA's stuff to do with microchips, that comes out of MK Ultra.
Crazy
Because they
stuff.
they were testing electrodes in the brain, and that turned into microchips in the brain. So
Yeah.
John C. Lilly was a pioneer of that.
Yeah. What else is going to be coming? Like, what other predictions do you have, or things that people don't know about that they should know about with the Great Reset or any of this stuff?
Yeah, I don't know about predictions. I mean, they definitely say that I think that what they seem to want to do is to blow up the existing system and economy to say, haha, look, it doesn't work. So here's our solution. Here's our universal basic income. Here's our, Fed coin crypto that you all need to be on. I think that they'll probably try to go with something like that. And, they have goals of population reduction by 2040 and 2050. So, how they would go about that, I don't know. I mean, they might try to do a giant war. It might be a bio event. I mean, who knows?
Yeah. Well, and the last time I had you on here, we talked about aliens. You don't believe in aliens. You told me to watch this movie Mirage Men, which I did. It was really fascinating. But now that this video comes out that the Navy puts out of a UFO, and they say we don't know what this is. I mean, but I don't know if I trust the government. But then, so if it's not aliens, if it's what is it? I mean, is this some sort of manipulation technique that the government is using to control us?
Well, I mean, I don't know. Who knows what those blurry old camera footage, that could be anything. I mean, that could be completely made up. I mean, certainly there are unidentified flying objects, but it's a leap to go from that to extra biological entities. So I think that there's plenty of evidence that the alien mythology is a psyop itself. And again, the best book for that is Invoking the Beyond by the Collins brothers. They spend about 300 pages in their book going through the CIA documents about creating Majestic 12 and that being a psyop and sort of promoting this idea of space brothers and all that. So there's a lot of different usages for the space brother mythology and the alien mythology, panspermia and so forth. So I think that anytime you see naval intelligence or quote the Navy coming out telling you about aliens and UFOs, you can bet that that's 100% a psyop.
Yeah, well, I mean, they don't say, I mean, because it's just a UFO. We don't know what it is. It is fascinating to me because they say that it couldn't be a technology that they're familiar with. So, I mean, it's possible that it's something from China then?
Yeah, but I mean, the government lies. I mean, yeah, it could be something from a foreign government, but I mean, to me, it's nothing. I mean, they come out with these all the time. I mean, they've been saying that there's flying saucers for, 50 years, 60 years. And I mean, it just doesn't add up to me. But what does make sense is that it would be a very useful tool for social engineering.
Yeah, well, that's because that's what they were in that Mirage Men movie. That's what they did is they made the guy think that there was aliens, and they made him think he was crazy, and they drew him they forced him to the hospital because they really did make him crazy, just so that they could hide what they were doing, which is like, and we still don't know what were they doing over there. There's still a lot of mysteries with Area 51.
Yeah, but I mean, even sort of mainline books have pointed out that the alien smokescreen is a cover for either black operations, drug running. It could be any of those things. That's probably what it really is at those bases.
Okay. Last thing that I got to ask you about. I don't know if you know anything about this conspiracy theory, the Denver airport. What the hell's going on with that? Are you familiar with this?
Yeah, this is, it's kind of one of the classic internet conspiracy theories. It's been around for a long time. And there really is an underground base underneath the Denver airport. It's pretty well known. It's pretty easy to verify that. I think there's, the government has many underground bases all over the United States. So that's not a conspiracy theory. It's a real thing. And usually it's explained as continuity of government. So in other words, if there's an attack or if the US went down or something like that, there would be facilities for the preservation or the continuity of order in the United States, in the case of some big event. So that's the public reasons for those things. I mean, you can find all kinds of public news articles and documentaries on the underground bases. So the Denver airport is one of those, but I think the reason that people pick that one is that the Denver airport was designed with a lot of really bizarre, dark artwork.
Yeah.
This seems to suggest these sort of apocalyptic themes and depopulation. So I think that's why people find that one particularly fascinating.
Yeah, that's called I think they call them the D.U.M.s, right? Deep underground military bases. That's a real thing.
And I mean, this has even been in mainline literature for a long time. James Bamford, who wrote the first book on the NSA, famously back in the early 80s, he talks about underground cities and underground bases in the first few chapters, and that's a famous, I think, a Pulitzer winning book from the 80s. So it's a real thing. What all those bases and underground cities and underground facilities are up to is anybody's guess. I don't have any knowledge of that.
Scary shit. Well, this has been a lot of fun. You'll have to come back again if we still have a civilization, or maybe we'll be in the same gulag or something. Who knows? So Yeah, my friends are like they're real like doomsday preppers. You know, they think they're always
really?
assuming the worst. So who knows? But I mean, it's interesting to think about it, but I try not to get too wrapped up. And I think last time the advice that you gave me and my viewers was just to try to stay off the internet too much and try to be more self-sufficient. I think that is
Yeah.
good advice, regardless
Yeah, I agree
if
with
the
that. I
world's going to
mean,
end or not.
the more off the grid you can be, the better. I don't think you have to be totally,
No,
a hermit. You don't have to run to the
no, no,
hills
no.
yet, but
Yeah, not yet.
yeah, right.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Jay. Everyone should get the book. It's called Meta Narratives. Here it is. Essays on Philosophy and Symbolism. Good
Yeah,
stuff.
exactly.
Yeah, I need to
Thank you,
read
man.
it again.
Appreciate
And
it.
I
It
got a
was
lot more work to do because you mentioned a lot of things that I want to do a deep dive on. So I'll have to have you back.
All right. Well, thanks, Chuck. Appreciate it. Good chat.
All right. See you later, Jay.
Have a good day.
Bye. Thanks again to Jay Dyer. He doesn't do charities, so if you're a regular listener to the show, you can support any of the other ones that I've promoted. Or if you want to support Jay, make sure to buy one of his books or pay for his content on Redfin. He was demonetized from YouTube, which is really stupid in my opinion. But you can find more links to his content on his website, which is in the show notes. My website is in there as well. Check out my other interview with Jay or some of the other episodes I've done. The playlist should come up on YouTube that has all the authors and things. And make sure to subscribe again and hit that bell so that you get the notifications whenever I post something. Thanks for watching. Have a great day and shoot for the moon.